funding formula and what it was the requirements for ARPA funding money that they got last year in terms of perpetual affordability, and also break it down by home ownership money and also by rental units. And also, to add to the plate, there are a lot of other funding sources that go into these deals, and what are their requirements for perpetual affordability. It's a mouthful and a tall task, but hope you can get us started, Jen.
Excuse me, I think I can get you started, and you're likely to have
Frozen.
questions, and I hope that I could follow up on a more detailed level if there are questions I can't answer today. So generally, funding that comes to the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board from the state and flows through VHCB, when we put that into a housing project, as Gus said yesterday, we require that project to be permanently affordable, and we do that through housing subsidy covenants, and that's true for both rental projects as well as home ownership. There are some things that we fund that have a small amount of funding, say a grant for home accessibility that might be under $10,000, that happens through the Vermont Center for Independent Living, that would not require that home to be permanently affordable or any ongoing restrictions on that. So the policy question and balance is what level. Well, under VHCB, whatever we administer, and that's the state funds, and we also apply that to the federal funds that we administer, regardless of whether or not the federal rules require permanent affordability. But if there are some instances where there's a very small amount of public investment or a small subsidy, there are instances where there aren't permanent affordability requirements. And for VHCB, an example of that are those grants for home access improvements, which are improvements to bathrooms and ramps and entrances and that sort of thing.
Like the ones for mobile homes?
They're for mobile homes, but they're for other single family homes, or there's a whole range.
Yeah.
But other than that, we do require permanent affordability. And that's also true for mobile home parks. If we fund the acquisition or infrastructure improvements, we require a large percentage or all of them to be, those lot rents to be kept permanently affordable.
So when you give money out through your general fund or property transfer tax money, or through ARPA money recently, an organization like CHT comes to you and say, we have this project, a private public partnership, or maybe they're doing it themselves. If you give them money and you're a part of the deal and it's rental housing, what are the perpetual affordability requirements on that go along with your money?
Well, very, very generally, we require units to remain affordable at 80% of median in perpetuity. And our housing subsidy covenants also go beyond that to say that there will be best efforts or to keep some percentage of the units affordable below 50% of median. Now, as you know, very often, if it's a rental project, then those our money is the soft source that helps bring in the low-income housing tax credits into the deal or into the project, into the development. And those low-income housing tax credits also come with affordability restrictions. And I'm speaking in very broad terms, but generally for a low-income housing tax credit for a project, for the units that get those tax credits, they need to be affordable at 60% or below. There are lots of other layers to all this, but that's generally how it works. And then also in Vermont and VHFA, when they allocate federal tax credits, it's not required by the feds, but VHFA requires those units to remain permanently affordable.
60% of AMI or which median income?
Yes, I'm sorry, the area median income. So the rents have to be affordable to a household at 60% of the area median income. And then there's another percentage that are lower than that, but so there can be multiple layers within a project, but
So I'm going to bring Chris Donnelly in, jump in at any time here because you're one of the nonprofits the money goes to. Does sometime are you involved in a project where you develop the project pretty much entirely on your own and you are the owner of a rental property? And is there other times where you are a middle person and deal with private developers? How does that work, and how are perpetual affordability covenants work in that instance, and is there a difference?
Yeah, thanks. For the record, Chris Donnelly with the Champlain Housing Trust. We are typically, when we're involved in a rental real estate development project, we're working in partnership with private sector, but we'll be owning the building. And so all of the units in the building will be falling under these affordability covenants. As Jen said, though, there are multiple layers of the different funding sources. For example, the housing revenue bond that you passed required that some of those units be affordable to people up to even 120% of median income. So there is a whole range of different, and then some of, I can tell you, Senator Sorokin, that Laurentide Apartments, 76 apartments that we built on North Ave, you were at the, I think you were at the ribbon cutting for that. That had some apartments that were restricted at 30% of area median income, and some that were restricted below 120. And so this quite a puzzle that we put together, but they all have some level of restriction.
Okay, just to jump ahead, maybe it'll help us. We hear about a lot of the developments like the Farrell developments, the big one in Burlington, or at City Place when they were talking about, whereas there's a mix of perpetual affordable unit and market rate housing. How does that happen when, if money's coming through you guys, you say all of your units, when you're involved, all have perpetual affordability requirements?
oh, go ahead, Chris.
I'm sorry. I think the simplest way that we've been doing it has been that in Burlington there's an inclusionary zoning provision that they have, private developers have to provide for affordable housing, and they usually work through us. But the easiest way to do it is to actually say, okay, you have this site, and to see, Eric will say, you can build here and on the site, and we'll work with him to make that happen through the permitting process. But there'll be separate buildings typically.
I'm not sure I understood the answer. So even though he's getting support from you, he can build market rate housing with that money?
He's not getting support from us. What is happening is that we're developing a parcel. He's subdividing his larger parcel, and we're getting a parcel to build on.
And so he's doing market housing on his part, and you're doing affordable housing on your part.
Exactly.
Got it.
Isn't there situations where you act as a contractee of a developer like Eric Farrell, where you monitor or supervise the perpetual affordability element of some apartments that he's running? You check the new tenants coming in, you make sure that the equity or the income levels are correct and the rents are correct. And, I've heard him say several times, he just turns that over to you to work with on those apartments.
That's much smoother for us to work in partnership with him to develop something that we would own. But we have offered that service to private developers to do that kind of compliance in the past. And I'd have to double check whether we're doing that with any specific developers or not. We are not doing that directly with Eric right now.
Perhaps you're doing it in St. Albans.
We might be. Yeah.
Senator Brock, and I have to apologize. I'm really having some technological difficulties here. So I missed 3/4 of what Chris said, but go ahead, Senator Brock.
Randy, I think you're muted.
You're muted.
Let's try it again. All right.
Yeah.
I share your technological problems, and I went out yesterday and bought a new iPad and threw my other one away. So hopefully this will help. I just have a question about permanent affordability and the effect of inflation and time. As you look at what happens just over a period of 10 or 20 years, particularly with respect to inflation and rents, and also what constitutes a percentage of area median income. And I think back to like the early 80s, for example, where we got into a period of hyperinflation in which rates were going up and interest rates were at 21% and so on and so forth. What would be the effect of the concept of permanent affordability with those variable situations?
Well, I think it hedges against massive displacement for low-income households. I think having that locked in rent and affordability, on a certain level, our rents fall under what people would call a rent control system. We're not allowed to just raise the rents willy-nilly. It's all tied to the what the market is and what people can afford. And so
presumably, though, there would be certain expenses and so on associated with maintaining these properties, keeping them up and running and dealing with capital improvements and so on that would have an effect. And inflation would have an effect on those kinds of things. And I'm just kind of interested in how that would work based on the concept of permanent affordability.
Well, Senator Brock, I could say, so over time, although not quickly, incomes do rise, and the covenants are based on what the area median income is at that time. So those rents do eventually, the affordable rents do eventually increase. When we underwrite a project, we assume, we ask the developer to show us how the project can work, assuming a 3% increase in, because you can't predict the future, but that the project can work financially with a 3% increase in income and a 5% increase in expenses. Pro formas and budgets, the real world always turns out to be something a little bit different, but that's the way we approach projects at the beginning to make sure that we sort of stress test the finances.
Well, that's kind of my question in many ways, is in terms of stress testing of how far do you go, and do you consider these kinds of hyperinflation situations, for example, because these things have happened.
That's the way we try to address it. And the affordability covenants, because they're based on income, the rent has to be capped at a rate that's affordable to somebody at a certain percentage of the area median income. So that does change over time.
I wonder if there's anything that perhaps you've done offline that you could show me or present to the committee that would show how you've done projections based on extreme changes or changes that have historically happened that do in fact result in very, very high inflation, and how permanent affordability works in those situations.
Well, we've never had a project that we've invested in that has failed because they haven't been able to adapt to the changing circumstances.
I don't think you've had any situations that have hit the 1980, 81 inflation levels that you've invested in, have you?
I can't speak to that, but I can offer an example of when energy prices really spiked. That created a great deal of distress for a lot of the properties because of their fuel costs. And so some of them were, their operating budgets became very, very tight. And what we did as a state and VHCB did at the time was to go through a period of time of helping those projects make energy efficiency improvements so they could better manage those energy costs. So then energy costs come back down, but maybe they're about to spike again. So those are the kinds of things, if there's a very, very big, dramatic change in the cost environment that as a state and a policy will try to address that. But you're right, we can't control in advance, absolutely, for a huge inflationary spike. But you've got to plan and do the best you can and allow.
What I'm really interested in, though,
financially strong
is
you can.
yeah, and the reason of the question, I'm just really interested in what's the extent of the stress test? How far does it go? And that's really my question.
We look out 20. They have to show us a pro forma for at least 20 years, and some of the federal funds require a pro forma that cash flows for 30 years.
But cash flow and in terms of a pro forma based on what is the highest stress level that you're using in terms of inflation, interest rates, and so on. That's what I'm just trying to get at is what's the extent of the test?
Yeah, it's assuming a 3% increase in income and a 5% increase in expenses over time. So.
Okay, and you don't do any stress tests beyond that then?
We do not run scenarios for like energy spikes or inflationary spikes or drops.
Okay, thank
For
you.
any of those costs either.
Thank you.
So 3% in CPI and 5% in what? I'm sorry, I meant
3% in income or, resource,
income, right.
And 5% in expenses.
In expenses, right?
Yeah.
So I just want to get back to.
But I think we're on. Yes.
I just want to get back to the question of the day, and I don't. I'm struggling to get an answer here, so let me just ask the question as it's been proposed to us. That under the. Oh God.
Oh dear.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, we can hear you. We can hear you, Michael. Yeah, because I'm not sure what his question was. Because if he comes back in a sec,
I'm back.
Great. Okay, we can hear you.
This is really getting very frustrating.
Yes, we can hear you.
I don't know what's wrong with my computer. It's fully charged. Well, I'll try it one time. We may have to. Scott, is there anything that you could speak to somebody as to what we can do? I mean, this is like the 5th time I've frozen up.
I'll go put a request in with IT and see what they can do.
Okay, so I'm gonna leave my video off. The question as it was posed to us was for the ARPA dollars that are going into housing now and in the future, are we asking enough in terms of perpetual affordability? And it's mostly, I think, in terms of the rental housing market and the fact that for priority housing projects, at least there's some requirement of 20% of the units being built in a priority housing project. Only 20% have to be perpetual affordability, and the perpetual affordability takes the form of a 15-year control on the rents. And I just hope you can answer that question just directly, because I don't even know that there are those projects out there.
So, Senator, the ARPA funded projects have deeper levels of affordability than what priority housing projects, than the current definition of priority housing projects, for the most part. The affordability levels of priority housing projects are guided by a 400-page Treasury rule, the appropriating language that the legislature included, which emphasized serving those who were experiencing homelessness, and then also guidelines that the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board adopted for how ARPA funds are going to be used. So the overall purpose of ARPA funds is to help people recover from the pandemic.
Right.
And help disadvantaged communities that were hurt more by the pandemic than others. So VHCB, following the Treasury rules, the legislature's priorities and our own guidelines based on other policies has said that we will provide ARPA funds to projects for people who are dedicating units to people who are experiencing homelessness. And we are now expanding that to say that it can be, if there is an area where there's a real shortage of housing, which is most places, ARPA can also be used for units that are affordable up to 80% of median. So most of the nonprofits that apply to us for ARPA funds have much deeper levels of affordability than that. It's got the usual, almost all the units are below 80. There might be a few market rate units. A lot of them are below 50% of median. And then they will have to, and they agree to dedicate a certain number of units specifically to housing the homeless. And they've got to work. So, well, I'll leave it at that. So that's true for our nonprofits. That's the type of project they usually do. And they're doing an additional emphasis on serving those who are experiencing homelessness. Our private developers are also eligible to use ARPA funds, and that's great because we need more housing, and we need everybody on board bringing more housing on online. So some of the projects that are proposed and that we funded by private developers are basically the same as what the nonprofits do. So almost all the units are affordable. Some are targeted to the homeless, and the units that we help provide funding for are all perpetually affordable. Now, there are a handful of projects that have come to us. We funded a couple, and we've got a few more in our, we have applications for, are now reviewing, are from private developers who have a larger development, a larger project, and they want to use ARPA funds for a piece of that. So we have either funded that or considering it. And for those units, they've got to target them to the homeless or be affordable at 80%, and they've got to be permanently affordable. But that may be 5 out of 20 apartments in a building. So if that's the case, that ARPA funded project, well, in that instance, okay, say 5 units out of a 30 unit building. We're still getting a good ARPA investment there, because maybe here's a private mixed income development that would have been not affordable at all, but they're come to us for some ARPA funds, and they're going to keep 5 of those units permanently affordable and for a period of time dedicate them to the homeless. But overall, it might not meet a changed definition of priority housing projects. So, Senator, I think you're saying if we added another layer to the definition of priority housing projects that says that ARPA funded projects have to meet a higher threshold, I would say some of the projects we funded so far with the private developers would meet that threshold, and others would not. And I don't know what the full implications are of all of that. And I can't give you details on how many in which category. Just haven't had enough time to dig into that.
Right. So, Madam, Mr. Chair, may I ask? May I follow up?
Yeah, I froze again, so I didn't hear the answer, but go ahead.
Okay. I think what Jen is saying is that there is ARPA money flowing to some private developers. They are building some small subset of units on these projects that are affordable and will be perpetually affordable. The question that Jen is addressing is the question we're interested in, which is, would developers bite at if ARPA money is going to them, would developers bite at a 70-30 ratio versus the 80-20 that exists now? Would developers, both nonprofit and private developers, bite at 70-30, 60-40, 50-50? If we required that with ARPA money, if they're using ARPA money to develop, would these developers bite at a more substantial ratio for affordability? I think that's the question, really. That's the bottom line. And Jen is saying perhaps, but she needs more time to find out from developers, and we would need to hear from some private developers.
You can't hear me, right?
We can hear you. So that's the question, I think, Jen.
Yes, and I think that I could say that many of the projects that we have funded with ARPA funds would meet that higher threshold for priority housing projects, but some would not. And I can't tell you how many would and how many wouldn't, because I haven't seen what the definitions would be, and we'd have to look at the specifics.
And those are ones that are in play now, as opposed to ones, if we pass this legislation saying you can only get ARPA money if you commit to a 70-30 or 60-40. That hasn't happened yet either. So you're talking about projects that you're already working on.
Yes, and my sense is that you're not talking about saying you've got to meet a certain percentage to get ARPA, because we have really detailed guidelines and procedures, and I mean, that's all set. But what you're saying is, if you want to qualify as a priority housing
project
and you get ARPA funds, you might have to meet a higher threshold, I think is what you're suggesting.
Yeah.
Could I offer another thought about all that? Because I'm not sure that what's being considered is consistent with the intent of your bill, which is to provide certainty and clarity and allow projects to move forward through Act 250 and local permitting processes more easily if they're good projects. I think what you're contemplating, or the suggestion I've heard here, is going to add another layer of complication that is going to be difficult to communicate to developers and may run counter to a lot of what you're trying to do in your omnibus housing bill.
Right.
Another thing that you could think about, I mean, if legislators are really unhappy with the level of affordability that's required to meet the definition of a priority housing project and basically get a Act 250 pass, you could look at the definition of a priority housing project and think about whether you want to change that versus adding on a layer in Act 250 that has to do with a particular funding source that's only around for a few years.
Got it. I hear you. And so if that's the bigger question, is if we want to go there, we would, a smarter thing that would give developers clarity and certainty, which is what they want to go forward, that really what we should be looking at is changing the definition of a priority housing project and not applying it just for this short-term money piece with ARPA money.
Yes, and I'm not necessarily proposing that. I'm just saying that might, if this
That's
is
what I hear you saying.
You're trying to address, that might be the more appropriate mechanism.
So once again, I missed most of this, and as we go on, if we can't fix this, and Senator Clarkson, you can take over to run the committee. Keep going. I guess one question I have is, you said it's very few projects that get ARPA dollars where you have the project itself being a combination of market rate and affordable units. When that happens, is the default always that they just meet this 20%? Or is it, in some of those cases, you're requiring 60% or 80% or whatever? Or are you just defaulting to the priority housing project level at that point?
So when we fund a project, we don't really, when we fund a housing project, it's about what the local housing needs are, it's about our funding source and what the priorities are. It's about who we're trying to house, what's needed in that area, what funding sources are available, and what's the project that's come before us. The priority housing project definition does not drive that development from our perspective. If it happens to fit within that definition, it means an easier path for an affordable housing project to get permitted. But the priority housing project does not drive how the affordability is structured in the vast majority of the projects that we fund. It's a consideration for developers. If they know that they've got a good affordable project, and if they find a good site that's within the areas that are eligible for PHPs, they're going to go for that site if it meets all kinds of other criteria. If you're a private developer, you might want, so they might look at the priority housing project definition and say, okay, how can I figure out how to make 20% of my units affordable, because then I get an Act 250 pass? And that's good. We want them to include more affordable units, and they might work with a nonprofit, or they might now apply to us for ARPA, or they might structure their own financing in a way that has a mix of units, and some of which meet that 80% affordable definition. So so the priority housing project definition is not the primary way in which affordability gets set. I think the private developers will think about that and try to achieve at least 20%. And that's why priority housing projects are important, because that encourages them to include more affordable, at least some more affordable units in their projects. But those definitions are not at all what drive the nonprofit developments, because our affordability levels are so much higher than that. It's not really a consideration. It might drive where they think about locating the project, because they know they can get it permitted faster. And affordable housing projects, sometimes it just takes one or two people to oppose them and slow them down. I hope that helps.
It does help, but I guess I'm still a little confused if the message if the law and the message is that these subsidy dollars, be they VHCB transfer tax dollars or ARPA dollars that go through VHP or any other thing, require the money to be used for perpetual affordability. What rationale do you use to come up with, here's 10% of your overall project cost, we're helping you with ARPA dollars, and you can come to the conclusion, therefore you only have to do a percentage of the units affordable as opposed to 100% of the units being affordable.
So the guidelines that our board adopted sets per unit maximum subsidy limits. So a developer will come to us and they'll say, oh gosh, I need, so the number for private development, the number of units that they have to keep permanently affordable and at certain income levels is directly related to how much funding they apply for and we give them. And there's a back and forth around that. They'll submit an application to us. They'll say, we want to do, 10 units out of a 40 unit project. Can you give us X amount of ARPA? We'll say, yeah, well, you know what, that's more than we can do per unit. And you're going to need to add some more permanently affordable units, and oh, by the way, you need to, dedicate X number of those to the homeless, and who's the service provider you're going to work with. So there are those back and forth, but essentially the basic answer to your question is it depends how much money we put into a project. And then we work with them around how many are going to be coveted in and at what level.
So
does that answer your question?
Yeah.
But now I want to go back to the PHP thing. Are there situations where the amount of financial subsidy you're putting in is sort of trumped by PHP in requiring the 20%, and that's more than you would otherwise ask them to do for the financial stake you're putting into the project?
I don't know that it would be trumping, but yeah. So a private developer may think about asking us for enough money so that they can get enough subsidy to keep at least 20% of their units affordable over time and so they can meet the definition of priority housing projects. If they've got a location, the thing for us to remember in the back of our minds is that if they're in a location where PHPs are eligible, so that's a downtown designated area or a neighborhood development area, which are pretty that's only very certain areas in the state.
Okay.
So for the nonprofit developers, they do, the PHP definition, as I said, doesn't really, it may come into consideration for them in terms of location, but not in terms of affordability, because the affordability is so far in excess of what the PHP definition. So I think what I'm hoping I can leave the committee with is that the ARPA dollars are being used to create deep levels of affordability. They're also allowing some private developments to go forward that include market rate units that wouldn't otherwise go forward. And that's a good thing.
Right.
So there are mixed income projects that are going forward now that were stuck. But with the ARPA help, those are able to move forward. But the public investment is protected because they have to stay affordable permanently and they need to serve people who are experiencing homelessness.
Okay, Senator Clarkson, do you have a question?
Yeah, I did. So with both of you here, I would just love to ask, because you are the great minds on perpetual affordability. So I'm just going to dive into the other question we have that's before this committee, which is how do we effectively take this missing middle proposal that we have before us, which there are many attractive aspects to it, but how can we keep that investment of public dollars in meeting that cost gap that is being discussed? How can we make missing middle housing, home ownership, affordable into the future and guarantee? You two have seen this proposal, and our big issue, I think, at least my big issue, and I believe the chairs, and I think many of us, is with that public investment, we want to make sure that those houses remain affordable. Yes, that the new homeowners benefit when they sell them, they benefit and have some asset to walk away with, but that we make sure that they are continually affordable for the next several ongoing generations of home owners. That is, I guess, my question to you. And Mr. Chair, correct me if that's not a good question to pose to these two at the moment.
It looks like he's frozen again. And what I'd like to do is to jump in and then hand it over to Chris. But I would like to clarify something that came up yesterday so that maybe it's clear, and then kind of take it off the table for now. So yesterday, Gus talked about how we had granted $2 million to VHFA yes. for the construction financing risk pool, essentially. Right. Yeah. And that is one element of what VHFA has been proposing. Right. And you asked if that was going to be for perpetually affordable homes. And the answer is it may be or it may not be. So the right. perpetual nature of that is that it's going to revolve and can be used again. So the public investment is protected. So, and that's just to help developers get construction financing and maybe at a better rate. So that's just to help them get the financing. It doesn't help them bring down the cost or the value gap or the affordability gap. It's right. just, so it's one of three pieces. And so that's the piece that VHEB is doing. The perpetual nature of it is that it will revolve and can be reused again. And it may be for permanently affordable homes and it may not be.
Right. And it is for the developer. It's to reduce the risk for the developer. It is not for affordability for homeowners into the future. So yes. having listened to this proposal, and you two understand the perpetual affordability overlay on a project, how can we bake that in as you look at it at this proposal? How can we bake that in to this proposal so that we're more comfortable with investing public dollars in this project, in this idea?
I'll step in. Thank you for that question. And really, I have been listening to a lot of the conversations over the last few weeks, and I'm very heartened by the committee's kind of commitment to this principle and policy on permanent affordability. It's really great to hear. It's this kind of the beacon that we look at. So I just want to express some appreciation for that. I believe that this program was based on a national program that's been proposed called the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act. And this is in the Build Back Better bill. It's kind of, in simple terms, it's kind of a companion homeownership production development program to the low-income housing tax credit program that we're all familiar with. The program, when it does get passed, will have states will be able to design and develop their own programs, just like we did with the rental production program. And we chose at that point to make all of the rental housing that we develop with the tax credit permanently affordable. And we can choose with the home ownership tax credit when it comes to make those permanently affordable too. So that's a policy choice that we can make. We've also, as I think Jen alluded to, other federal programs that fund housing development here in the state. We add this layer of permanent affordability on all the time. When we had federal stimulus money after the market crash, and we went out and we bought foreclosed homes and fixed them up and sold them to new buyers, we made those permanently affordable too. So we've done this historically. We've always added in this other layer, because I can tell you, if you're in San Francisco, they're losing more affordable homes than they're building every year. And to get their Senator Brock's concern, that's just going to cost more to build something next year than it would be to build last year. With that kind of intro, I would also say that we like a lot of the proposal that's been put forward, especially, and I think everyone's in agreement that this value gap is really it's been a hard nut to crack. Yesterday, we did a little survey, just informal email around to some of our nonprofit partners in the state, and they said that there's no starter homes being built in their regions. And I can say that's not happening here either. There are no homes. So I think just even that value gap has a lot of benefit for folks. So I think I know the commissioner said that whatever program we develop, we should make sure that it encourages the development of homes, but it also for middle income people, but it also should work across the state. And I can tell you that our partners are ready to step up and do homeownership development. There just has not been the resources for homeownership development. What I think, as you alluded to, Senator Clarkson, that the real kind of issue here is what kind of affordability are we going to get when we spend this money? So what we've done is we've put together a kind of a proposal, a compromise that gets at some of that those affordability issues, and what I think has been described as this discount gap, the affordability discount or affordability gap. So in our suggestion, we'd include money for the value gap first. We're on board with that. That for projects that were accessing that program, that value gap program, that there'd be a little bit of a modest discount for buyers, just to kind of entice home ownership, something around $25,000 or less. Then we lock that in as VHFA has proposed to continue that subsidy with the home. It might depreciate over time, as we know, but at least it's a little enticement to get people to step up into home ownership. I think we could then layer in on that a larger subsidy for permanent affordability, and we could boost shared equity programs and Habitat for Humanity programs. I know Zach Watson was here from Central Vermont Habitat. There's a lot of interest in developing homes through the nonprofit sector, and it's just been under-resourced. And then I also think that there's another level of support that we can do that just encourage beyond the production of homes and helping subsidize new home construction, just encouraging people to buy homes. And I think the down payment assistance program that VHFA has run has been successful. I know this committee has been a big booster of the, giving some enticement to remote workers to move here. I think we could do a down payment grant program that supports first-time home buyers with $10,000 and first-generation home buyers with $20,000 to deal with equity issues. So I think this is a package, and I can provide you with all this, but I think this as a package together could kind of flatten that concern that we have that with the existing proposal that we would be or flatten that kind of equity concern that we have. The concern that we have is under the current proposal is that people that have more money get a better deal than people that have less money. And so that's where we get concerned. So I think this kind of more holistic approach would be a great path forward and really accomplish all the goals the administration has put forward and create a lasting kind of asset for the state. So that's what I would suggest.
Thank you. Chris, it would be great if you could flesh that out and send that to us, if that isn't too much of.
No.
Can you do that? Because I think you're right. I think it's a great package. If we can figure out that affordability gap, because the value gap we're all clear on, the affordability gap going into the future, if there was that discount that would then go back into a revolving, how with the formula used currently for the perpetual affordability for homeownership, that would be great, because that's the thing we haven't been able to get a handle on, is that affordability into the future for these projects. So that is, I think, the key. If you could send that to us, I think that would be great. And then this coupled with the first generation home buyer addition to the VHFA program for first time home buyers, I think you're right. I think that makes a great package, plus our relocating worker program. I think you're right, but I think just even those two pieces is great.
Mm-hmm.
Michael, are you back with us?
I'm using my phone. I don't know if that's going to be any better. I'm not sure.
We can see you and we can hear you.
Okay. So I missed most of that, but I did, before we move on to other things, I do want to get back to the question of changing the perpetual affordability requirements of receiving any funds, but especially ARPA funds. I just want to be clear from Jen and also from Chris. Is that something you see a need for, PHP aside, in terms of what you do now, in terms of your dissecting these requests and saying these are, and advocating for, I guess, as many perpetual affordable units as possible when you're dealing with the private sector. Do you see a need to a benefit of the legislature bumping that up, or is that a serious question that needs a lot more investigation? I mean, I do have concerns, or I'd like to see as much perpetual affordability as possible, and I don't know if we're at the right sweet spot. I do see concerns of projects not being built at all if we require them no longer being mixed use housing, but now if they take any dollars from the state, they have to be 100% perpetually affordability or 80% perpetually affordable. So I'd like to hear your comments on that as housing experts, whether you feel that we do have this, especially for PHP problem, we at least have this foundation of at least 20%. What are we dealing with here in terms of what we need to look at to make a judgment call, a proper due diligence on this?
So I'll say that there are trade-offs that you make in your public policy making. For example, with the VHIP program, you've allowed for $30,000 of ARPA or CRF, other federal funds to go into a private landlord's home to rehab it. And then the affordability term is 5 or 10 years. So you've made the decision that the benefit of improving those homes is worth this small, modest grant. And it's hard to think of a $30,000 grant as a small, modest grant, but that's what it is today. So I think there are points in time where you may want to, and you do this with other programs too that are outside of housing that you don't look for recapture. So I think there is as I think you may have used the term sweet spot. I think there is a sweet spot. I'm not sure exactly where it is, and if there's the same sweet spot for every program, but I can tell you that when you invest in permanent affordability, you'll have that asset there for the long term, and you do some trade-offs to get the work done. I think with some of these smaller programs. I don't know if that gave you enough of an answer, Senator.
Well, it sounds like, I guess we don't know entirely what the development world is out there, and we would need to hear from developers as well as we start going into this thing. But it sounds like we could require, one way we could approach this is we could require all the VHCB money to go to nonprofits to be the developers, and then we get 100% perpetual affordability. I'm not sure that's a good idea. We might not get as much overall housing built. I think mixed use housing has advantages in and of itself. And to the extent we impose, I'm not saying 20% is the right amount or 15 years is the right amount, but to the extent we impose more, I think it's going to be a disincentive to some mixed use housing being developed. Would you say that's true, Chris?
That may be true. I think the other way to look at this is that oftentimes the nonprofit sector, nonprofit housing developers will work very closely with the private sector, and without that investment in the nonprofits, the private sector won't bring things forward. I'll give you an example. When the first month that I was working at CHC, actually the Burlington Community Land Trust at that point, 17 years ago, I organized a ribbon cutting with Governor Douglas to open up 60 condos right behind Shaw's on Shelburne Road, next to where the interchange is from 189. Over half of those condos were permanently affordable, 31 to 29, so 60 condos. 29 were market rate. Governor sat there and in his remarks said that one of his staff people were buying their first home there. And that development still is viable. It has people, both living with a shared equity home and a market rate home right there in the same building. We did that with Eric Farrell and Danny Morrissey. A couple of years later, we did a similar project with Don Turner up in Milton, where we worked with him to bring down the price and lock in the price of roughly half of, I think it was 25, 26 homes in a development in Milton. Those single family homes right now, they're nice starter homes. those single family homes right now, will appraise at over $300,000. They were appraised at 200 or 220 when they were built in 2008. But half of those, or a good portion of those, have that locked in subsidy. And when we sell them now, they'll sell for 180 or 190. So I think there's a benefit to pairing the development of the nonprofit sector with the market. And those two, are probably the last large new construction development that we've done at CHT since this past year when we're building the condos in Winooski at Butternut. So, and that's what I'm hearing from our partners around the state, is that we just have not put the resources into building. And so that's why we have this great opportunity right now.
Yeah. Well,
So when you do a project with a private sector, all of your units, you own half of the units and they own half of the units, or a certain percentage, and you make all of your units affordable, perpetually affordable, and they just rent at market rate?
Or they sell these are two home ownership deals. Yep. Exactly.
Okay, so there's no public dollars going into the portion of the private sphere. It's just a project that is on contiguous land, or
Yeah, they will they coexist, and they're almost codependent. Maybe the codependent is the wrong word, but they're dependent on each other.
okay. So I guess I'm asking Jen as well. I mean, it seems to me that this is would be a major change, if one is even warranted, that we'd have to really go a lot deeper the problem, and we could study it or do something like that. The problem is we have all these ARPA dollars right now that are going out the door that are sizable, maybe even $100 million or more, that's still let to be go out under contract. And do we want to miss that opportunity to present to do this? I mean, another choice might be to leave this, to suggest a study of the same and leave it to the House that may have more time to delve deeper into this. But it just doesn't. I guess I'm looking for your opinions. You're the only two people who are here, so I'm sorry, of whether this is something that we can lightly go about changing at this point.
Senator, may I ask, are you talking about additional requirements for ARPA-funded projects around affordability, or are you speaking right now to the definition of priority housing projects under Act 250?
I think the question, correct me if I'm wrong, Senator Clarkson, I think the question we were posed is putting more strings attached on ARPA funds.
I think that's correct. And I think what I heard Jen say is that the dueling goods, because we're always balancing goods here, and we always balancing competing goods, and that the good that we put at risk by doing that is the need for clarity and certainty for developers if we do that. But that is what the question is in front of us. The ARPA, what can we tie to ARPA dollars that produces more affordable rental units for us and more affordable housing? And that's what we're getting from members of the Senate who are really concerned, and ourselves. I mean, this is a big issue for us as well, is, I said it earlier, which is what's the bang we're getting for our public dollars in terms of affordability? And I hear Jen saying that at this point in time, it probably would be smarter long-term to change the definition of PHP, which is a bigger challenge. That will take more time. But but we want to be able to affect the ARPA dollars, which are going out now as we speak and as we go forward. So I think this is the challenge is it's not, I think we'd have to speak to some private developers and we have two nonprofit developers here, or we have two people that work. One is anyway, to see if they would bite at, if that would be a hindrance, would that raise the bar so that people weren't interested, or would that still make it, if we shifted it to 70-30 for ARPA dollars and then revisited the definition at when we had more time? I think that's the question is can we do it now, or do we have to wait to redefine PHPs? Because I think some of us are ready to do it now and tie it to ARPA dollars, but is that too big? Does that create too big a hurdle at midstream?
I
Can I maybe answer the question? I'm sorry. I just think maybe I've left you, maybe I haven't been clear. All the ARPA housing dollars that are going through the Vermont Housing Conservation Board, and that is the vast majority for housing development, are for deeply affordable units. To date,
Right.
we've really done it only for units that are affordable up to 30%, and we're just now beginning to consider projects up to 80% of median in some instances, and they're all required to be permanently affordable.
We're clear on that, Jen.
Okay.
I think the clarity we need now is, can we increase the percent of affordable units required in a PHP if they use ARPA dollars?
Okay.
Is that not the question, Mr. Chair?
That's a different question than adding up different requirements for all ARPA funded housing. So thank you. Now I understand what you're focused on.
We are.
I'm starting to the place where I'm getting to at this point is this is a solution in search of a problem that we haven't identified yet. In terms of the use of any dollars, ARPA or otherwise, I have not heard anything that leads me to believe that VHCB is not adequately protecting the interests of perpetual affordability in their negotiations over projects, such that we would have to intervene and tell them they have to do more, and that even if 1% of the project is with state or federal dollars, 100% of the project has to be affordable. I haven't heard anything there. On the PHP side, I think what I've heard is that the value of avoiding permitting is maybe avoiding a 6-month delay and $30,000 in permitting costs. So I'm not sure that anybody has identified that the amount of a savings that gives to a developer is in need of change in terms of the 20% in 15 years. I mean, we could tip the scales a lot differently so that the cost in terms of the pro forma to the developer goes skyrocket if we make it 90% and 30 years. But we haven't heard the problem yet that the 20% and the 15 years is not the sweet spot. And until someone proves that to us, that we are really missing the boat on that, I don't think we have an identified problem that we should rush into a fix on. And that's where I'm at. And I certainly be willing to require a study of this quick. It still probably would affect years of ARPA funding. And if the House has more time to identify this problem, I'd be open to seeing what they come up with. But in the time frame we have to move this bill forward, or any bill forward, I just think we're using a lot of valuable time on an issue that's come up at the very last minute.
I don't disagree, Mr. Chair. I think the one additional piece is that what doesn't happen with PHPs is money. As Jen has said, money doesn't go to them, and they get this benefit of a shorter permitting period, and they get and the saving the permitting money, and they get the 20% in the 15 years. What doesn't go to the PHPs is money to apply to the project. And what I think the request is that if there is that addition of ARPA money going to a PHP project, could we ask them for more affordable units? I think that's the simple question. Is that right?
Well, no, I'm not just sure it's that simple, because we can ask more of them in terms of perpetual affordability based upon the funding source. I mean, the more affordability you put into the formula to get the PHP designation, the
Right.
less number of units they could potentially
Right.
do, or they're going to have to price the market rate housing beyond market rate housing. It's going to have to be luxury housing to make the numbers work, because all they're really getting from the PHP designation is a small savings in time and money. But what people are suggesting, they should pay a lot more towards make that much more expensive to them in terms of extending the perpetual affordability or extending the number of units. That's going to affect the other units. It's a very complicated. I think it's a very complicated decision to get to. That's going to take a lot of time, and we don't even know if we're at the right number now.
Right.
And it's being raised at the last minute. Do we want to get a housing bill out? Do we want to get an economic development bill out? We could spend, at least a full day on just this issue, and I'm sure we're going to have a lot more questions as to how it's going to affect building in the state of Vermont. So, what time is it? I don't have.
It's 10:15. I think we need to take our break, and we have because I know we have more witnesses coming in at 10:30. I think I just would, yeah. I think the request was simpler than that, but I think we can.
We're going to take a break right now.
Yeah.